everyone. Welcome to my little mini-sode of book reviews. So last week I was on winter break and I went to Florida, and you might be like, Kate, did you go to the Everglades? Did you go to Universal Studios? Did you go to the ocean? No, I did not. What I did do was spend time with some family that I really, really miss and love and read, which is exactly what I wanted to do on my winter break. So tonight I'm going to share with you the 7 books that I read on vacation and give you a little quick review of each. To say up front, 6 of them are horror. One of them is by a well-known horror author, and also Lister will probably be making an appearance, like now. So the first book that I read is The Vessel by Adam Nevill. Adam Nevill first got on my radar, I want to say back in the early 2010s with Last Days. He also wrote The Ritual and No One Gets Out Alive, both of which have been adapted into film for Netflix. The Vessel was actually written as a screenplay, which gives one reason why it is so short. It's only about 150 pages. Then I want to give a shout out to Nightworms. I did get this one in my Nightworms subscription box. And this one has, as you can tell by the cover, it has the creepy elderly woman. It's got the full core. It's got the single mother trying to do the best she can with an abusive ex that's lingering around. And really, it's a pretty straightforward story. Jess, the protagonist, is a nurse or a caregiver, an at-home caregiver who goes to the manor of, what is her name? Flo. And Flo is, wheelchair bound, kind of suffering from dementia, physically abusive to Jess at first, but then Jess brings her daughter Izzy with her one night for a shift, and Flo and Izzy really have this connection, and then Izzy begins exhibiting some strange behavior. And so it does go into folk horror territory, and Adam Nevill does folk horror very well. So I'd have to say that out of 5 stars, I'd give this one a solid 3. It works as a novella. It's not really fleshed. A lot of his other novels are a bit more fleshed out. This one is pretty succinct, but it gets the job done. And I can definitely see this one being adapted for film as well, as he intended. And then the second one is Michael McDowell's The Elementals. And this one is a reissue of the 1981 paperback by McDowell. Now, that was part of the big, 70s, 80s, early 90s horror publishing boom, which, if you've not read Grady Hendrix paperbacks from hell, I highly, highly recommend that. Valancourt books have been doing a great job of reissuing some of these, paperbacks from that golden era, and The Elementals is one that they did reissue, and it stands out as being a shining example of the nexus of what that era produced. Michael McDowell went on to write the screenplays for Beetlejuice and Nightmare Before Christmas, and this story is about 2 families, the McCraes and the Savages. And they are intertwined through marriage and through just long-term friendship. And it begins with a very interesting incident at Marion Savage's funeral. She's the matriarch. And then the families decide to retire to Beldame. Is that what? Yes, Beldame, yeah. Which is a very isolated coastal retreat with just 3 houses: the McCrae house, the Savage house, and a house in between them, simply known as the 3rd house, which is being taken over by a large dune of sand. Something lives in that house. And so it really goes into just basically the family, and as they're dealing with the matriarch's death and just kind of family issues, and then also the daughter of one of the. There's a lot of different family members, but India is 13. She's the youngest of the family, and she's the one that first notices and makes contact with the entity in the house. It was written in 1981, so there are some tropes that have been played out by 2022. Including that featuring the housekeeper Odessa, who who they turn to for basically every kind of thing that they need answered. And Odessa at one point is like, "Look, I don't know any more than you all." But one thing I was not expecting with this is the amount of humor in it. It's I probably mentioned this is a Southern Gothic. There's some very wry humor and some wry dialogue, and I just had a blast reading this. Was it very creepy? Not really, but it did have some interesting imagery, and of course, I guess maybe because I live in the Midwest and don't deal with sand a lot, the image of this house being overtaken by sand was not the most terrifying thing to me, but perhaps it is if you live on the Gulf. So I highly recommend Michael McDowell's The Elementals. I'd say that out of 5 stars, I'd give this one a solid 4.5. I really enjoyed this one. All These Subtle Deceits, shout out again to Nightworms. This one is by C.S. Humble, and it is the first of I don't know if it's a planned series exactly, but it's definitely some books that are going to be coming out in a shared universe called Blackwell's Colorado. This one definitely, as the introductory book, does give you that feeling of the initial, you can tell that Humble is setting it up to world build, and I did like that. But it features William Daniels, who is an excommunicated exorcist, and has his own unique spin on the exorcism process. And a young woman has recently moved to Blackwell's, and it is hinted that Blackwell's is a kind of drawing place for occult incidents and supernatural goings on, and hints that even cryptids are thrown into the mix. And so Lauren moves to Blackwell's and is attacked in a nightclub bathroom by a supernatural entity. So she goes to William Daniels for help. But there's also a lot of other characters that you meet in William Daniels' journey to help her. So like I said, again, you're introduced to these characters. And C.S. Humble does a great job of making these characters intriguing. I'm ooh, I want to know more about Jay, the cryptid hunting mechanic, and Sarah, the private eye that gets beaten up all the time, and but we don't know why because she won't say what she does. But basically, it was fun. It was a quick read, and I'm interested to see what more happens in the Blackwell's universe. As far as the story goes, it was basically a possession story with a bit of a revenge twist. Not very graphic, not very frightening really, but definitely more of a dark urban fantasy in a way. So again, I'm interested to see what else C.S. Humble comes up with. So thank you, Nightworms. The longest book I read is actually 4 novellas by one of my favorite contemporary horror authors, Ronald Malfi's Ghostwritten. I have been a fan of Malfi for over a decade now. A Floating Staircase was the first one that I read by him, and he just writes good classic horror. It's just creepy. It's not overly graphic. He's very reminiscent of early Straub and that kind of horror. And so Ghostwritten is a series of 4 novellas that are all set in the shared universe. And one thing I liked was kind of seeing the little crossover between the different stories, I know where that came from. And so there's The Skin of Her Teeth, The Dark Brothers' Last Ride, This Book Belongs to Alo, and The Story. And I think my favorites were The Skin of Her Teeth and The Story, although I really did enjoy The Dark Brothers' Last Ride. And Book Belongs to Alo had a very Twilight Zone episode feel. If you've seen the Twilight Zone, the movie, there's parts in it that really were reminiscent to that. But one thing that these have in common, in addition to their shared universe, is that they all pertain to the written word and books and stories. So obviously, I'm on board for that. So I really liked it. And yeah, for being a 400-something page collection of novellas, it actually read, I think, really quickly. I really like his writing style. If you've not checked out Malfi, I highly recommend it. And if you love books, Ghostwritten, I think would be a decent place to start. Now I'm going to go to the one non-horror book that I read, but it's by one of our most beloved horror authors. I picked this one up at a little bookstore back in September. This novella is Basasstronauts by Grady Hendrix. So of course I'm like, oh my god, it's a Grady Hendrix I haven't read. I've got to get it. And so I finally ended up reading it. Stop eating that library.
That's true.
Yes. But he does say in the introduction that he initially started this back in, the days of the Occupy Wall Street movement, where, if you don't remember, I kind of remember, it was a while ago, but, it was a very populist movement. It was by the people, for the people kind of movement. And that is basically where he drew his inspiration from. So this takes place in a small town in South Carolina. And he, and this one washed up astronaut, Walter, he never quite made it off the ground, but his cousin did. And his cousin is now stranded in the International Space Station. And so Walter is like, we are Bobby's last hope. So he gathers up the town people and says, we're going to build a rocket. And of course, he's initially scoffed at, but then it becomes a movement. And then the movement starts growing. And then the movement gets out of Walter's control. So it's basically Walter and the ragtag group of what they call Redneck NASA, Redneck NASA, go on a rocket building spree. Yeah, NASA. So it was a quick read. It's a very quick read. I was not very impressed because it just, even for it being what it was, it just felt kind of slight. It's written with Grady Hendrix's typical panache. It's got, some funny things in it. But overall, I was not very impressed with this one. And it was also, like I said, I had to throw it in there. My only non-horror I read. So the last two I want to say, I'm going to give a little disclaimer of freedom to read and all that good stuff, because the last two are definitely considered splatterpunk. Splatterpunk is not for everyone. Extreme horror is not for everyone. So know what you like to read what you want to read. Know what you don't like reading about and avoid it. So one of the things that I read is The Devoured and the Dead by Kristopher Rufty. This is one of the Splatter Western series put out by Death's Head Press. This book is number 12. I have read most of them. There's one that I did skip. I do own most of them. I may have fallen a little bit behind. There was one that I did not read because all the reviews I read said that it had gratuitous content of sexual assault. That is not what I like to read. I do not like that. I did not read it. But this one I think is, and then also there was They Built a Gallows for You and Me by Cody Higgins. Mr. Higgins, I'm sorry, that book was bad. And I stopped reading in like 40 pages in. Not because of any of the content, just because it was a very interesting book. At some point, we might have to do a reading from it. But The Devoured and the Dead by Kristopher Rufty. First one I've read by Kristopher Rufty. I have to say it's one of the stronger entries in the Splatterpunk series, in my opinion. So 3 families and their indigenous guide and his family decide to travel through North Carolina Pass in the middle of winter to get to a gold rush town. So starts out very Donner Party reminiscent. However, there's a bit of a twist because the adults in the party partake of they desecrate a grave and they eat a meal that causes them to be cursed by the by the indigenous mother, who says that they will be because of their act, they will be cursed to always feel hunger and to only be sated on the flesh of their children. And so then it turns into like an interesting take on the Wendigo story. And so basically our protagonist is 11, he's one of the youth of the party, he's the youngest of the party. And then it becomes this tale of survival against their own parents, which then gets even more troublesome when this band of outlaws shows up. So it does go into some pretty bleak territory. There's some gut munching. If you don't want to read that, don't read that. However, I definitely enjoyed this entry. I think it was one of the better written. It had a pretty good story, and I liked the protagonist, and I liked the different take on the Wendigo. That hunger that just consumes you. And last is the most extreme book that I read. I'm in a Facebook group, and there was a lot of buzz about this one, and I was like, you know what, I might give this one a try. And it's Aron Beauregard's Playground. Stop right here if you cannot handle anything involving children. I can't handle anything involving cats or animals. So if this book was like a bunch of cats, I'm not going to read it. But I know what is real and what is fake, and this book is about a very twisted elderly rich woman who never has been able to have children of her own, so she decides that she is going to enact the worst revenge that she can think of, which is to build a playground and force children to try to make their way through it with fatal results. Everything is basically set up as a riddle that the kids have to solve to try to get from one end to the other, but of course somebody never makes it. And so but then also, I've not read anything by Aron Beauregard. I actually purchased this straight from the author. I do want to give a shout out. Support your small presses. Support your indie authors. If you can get something off of Amazon, sure, it might be cheaper, but if you can go through a indie press or the author themselves, you might get something cool, like a magnet and like a sticker that says, "Thanks, Kate," on the back. So this book, like I said, if you can't handle this content, stay away from it. Otherwise, it was actually a decently written book. Like I said, I've not read Aron Beauregard. It definitely suffered a bit from tell rather than show, but again, this is splatterpunk in extreme, so that is kind of par for the course. But it actually had an emotional depth that I wasn't really expecting. I think the characters were pretty well fleshed out, and it did have a point, and a lot of gratuitousness. So this one, I forgot to rate them. So going back, all these subtle deceits, I'd say 3 out of 5 stars. The Devoured and the Dead, I'd say 4 out of 5. Basasstronauts, I'd say 2 out of 5. Ronald Malfi's Ghostwritten, 5 out of 5 for real. Love Malfi. And Aron Beauregard's Playground, I don't know, this one's really hard to score, but if this is your cup of tea, give it a try. So that concludes this mini-sode of what Kate did on her winter vacation. What's up next? Me finishing Ghost Eaters by Clay McLeod Chapman. It's a library book, so I did not take it on vacation. So catch you next time.